Good afternoon and welcome to Chapter 11. In this particular chapter, we're going to talk about something that you're quite familiar with living here in the Midwest. The topic is going to be on agriculture, aquaculture. Wonder if you've thought about that. Aquaculture and the environment. And Chapter 11 lends itself well to coming out of biogeochemical cycles from Chapter 7 because we'll talk about some of the macro and micronutrients that are used in agriculture and aquaculture as well, and then the effects it has on the environment. So just to give you a bit of an overview of what we'll cover in this chapter, we'll take a look at not only agriculture itself, but its impact on its surrounding ecosystem. We'll look at questions such as, can we feed the world? As you've probably heard of, the Midwest, particular our area, we're considered the breadbasket of the world. And we've got some really interesting graphs that will show you why our part of the U.S. is considered the breadbasket of the world. We'll also talk about what we grow on the land. We know here that in the Midwest, we grow crops such as corn and soybeans, just to name a few. Down in Kansas, off to our south, wheat is a big crop in that particular area. But we'll talk about the different crops not only here in the Midwest, but throughout the U.S. and the world as well. So, for instance, sweet potatoes are grown in China, or at least that's their primary cash crop over in China. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Soils. Without soils, you don't have an agriculture in the traditional sense. Now, we'll talk about aquaculture a little bit later. We'll touch on that briefly. And as we know that farmers constantly are battling against pests, we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the future of agriculture. And then we'll touch a little bit on GMOs, genetically modified foods. We'll talk about it in particular in terms of biotechnology, farming, and the environment. And then we'll close out here this particular chapter on aquaculture. I think you'll find that kind of funny. So basically, the ecological perspective on agriculture, if you think about it, it is one of the civilization's greatest achievements, and its roots are 10,000 years old. We can go back at least 10,000 years and see the effects of agriculture throughout its history. I think it's also fair to say that agriculture has greater impact on the environment than any single human endeavor. And you'll see why when we talk about that a little bit. You see some of the statistics there in terms of the magnitude of agriculture. Approximately 38% of the Earth's land area is used. Now that excludes Antarctica. We're not considering Antarctica. Cropland in Europe accounts for about 22% of land area, and we'll see that in figure 11.5 a little bit later. So we know if you look at just the U.S., you see the dollar amount, 320 to 350 billion. However, with this, there are some effects, some positive and some negative in terms of environmental effects. You see some of the numbers right there on your screen. Approximately 250 million acres are treated with commercial fertilizers. About 65 million of the acres are treated with chemical insect pesticides. And then about 194 million areas treated with chemicals to control weeds. And something else, there's also a biological component to controlling pests that we'll talk about a little bit later. I find that's a pretty cool thing to look at. So farming in itself creates something called an agro-ecosystem because the agriculture component is not separate from its surrounding ecosystem. There is a symbiotic relationship between agriculture and its ecosystems and surrounding ecosystems. Now, when we talk about agroecosystems, again, that's how they differ from natural systems. There are 6 ways that this textbook has identified something called ecological succession. Now, that was not a concept that we covered in this particular course. But as we go through, basically the way that you can look at it, let me scroll down here. I think a picture's worth 1,000 words. So this is a pre-agricultural ecosystem. And so you have quite a bit of diversity here. You see some grass, you have rabbits, field mice. You look up here, you've got deer, bear, birds. So there are multiple types of systems or multiple types of wildlife, both in terms of, like I said, deers, birds, birds, and then grasslands, and then up here you see forest areas. But when we're talking about an agroecosystem, we're talking about basically a single unit. So in this particular case here, you see crops being grown in this top area that I'm surrounding here. We don't see any wildlife, and so we initially go from a system that has multiple diversity in terms of forest lands, and so then it begins to move into an area of a single point of crops being grown. Here we can look at it in terms of cattle, and here we can talk about it in terms of wheat. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. So this ecological succession, it can start, like I said, from a forest land, and then it transfers into a different type of material. And so whenever we introduce agroecosystems, it actually acts as a force to stop this succession of the ecosystem. What I've described below in the pictures is what we call monoculture. Large areas planted with a single species. So in this particular case, you see wheat down here. And I'm not exactly sure what this would be here, but there's a single type of crop. So we refer to that as a monoculture. So large areas planted with a single species. In other words, crops planted in neat rows and fields. Now, what you see here with the crops planted in single rows, predators or pests, whatever they may be, it makes it pretty easy to invade. There's nothing difficult here compared to this type of system where if you were to plant crops within the trees, there are multiple areas of navigation that a predator would have to go through before it got to the primary crop. Again, we'll talk about that more in some detail. Another way that it differs in agroecosystem, most of it requires plowing, although that particular idea of plowing is now beginning to be replaced by what we call no-till farming. And again, I'll mention that here in just a few minutes. But as we were in the early 20th century, and even back further, plowing is a way that we would basically disturb the natural soil. And nothing in nature repeatedly and regularly turns over the soil to a specific depth. So what we do with plowing, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it is you could consider it an injury to the ecosystem. Now obviously we get good things that come out of plowing. We get crops. That is a very strong positive. However, plowing can create some issues with ecosystems. Now what we're finding, especially I think since about 1996 especially, genetically modified crops are becoming more the norm. And in fact, it is taking place across the globe as we're finding it to be more and more successful. Now, one of the questions that we talked about in the overview is, can we basically be feeders of the world? But before we get to the answer to that, and that's not such a simple question to answer, we have to understand how crops grow and how productive they can be. Now recall when we were talking about biogeochemical cycles, for life to exist, especially for the macronutrients like the big six that we were talking about, nitrogen, phosphorus, those types of things. They have to be available at the right time and the specific right amount for species to grow and develop. So we'll need to look at that. And then we need to talk about sustainability. That is something we covered back in chapter 1. Can we continue to produce crops that will produce yields for future generations without causing issues to our ecosystem? So we want to make sure that it remains viable. Another question we need to ask ourselves in terms of feeding the world: can we produce this food without seriously damaging ecosystems? That's what I just said. If we're damaging our ecosystems, then our ability to continue to produce food will begin to decrease. We'll reach that tipping point. We talked about carrying capacity of the world. Recall that in a previous chapter. We are continuing to increase our population, which is continuing to demand more and more resources, natural resources, from the planet Earth. And so we need to see if there are ways that we can make the process more sustainable. And can we produce all this food and crops used only to produce fuels? We know here in the Midwest, we talk about ethanol. We use a lot of our corn to produce fuel. And so that's taking some of the food out of world production. So there's that idea. Can we continue to produce food to not only feed the U.S., but to also feed parts of the world, and also to produce fuels? These are not easy questions to answer. Now, when we think about the history of agriculture, we can go way back, and basically the gist of this is: how can we overcome environmental limitations and problems? What's one of the limitations, environmental limitations of agriculture? And it's something we talk about every day. It's the weather. It's the climate. That is a limitation to crops. In other words, if we don't get enough precipitation, or if we get too much precipitation as we're going through the different parts of the year. But that's just one example of environmental limitations. And as we solve these environmental limitations, however, each of these solutions creates new problems, and we'll see what those are later in this particular presentation. And there are actually some side effects that occur. It's like with drugs that we take, pharmaceuticals that we take for ailments, physical ailments that we have, health issues that we have. There are some side effects. The same thing applies in agriculture. And then we talk about the multiple pressures on the agricultural land. Land has, like we said, macronutrients and micronutrients, but we begin to deplete some of those nutrients, and it creates stress on the land. Something else that I'm thinking about: grazing, overgrazing from cattle and other types of livestock creates pressures on the land. If you have overgrazing, as we'll see here a little bit later in this presentation, that can lead to erosion of soils and erosions of our macro and micronutrients. So we have to consider that as we look at feeding the world. Now this here is a very interesting slide. So when we talk about arable, the term arable, in other words, that means the ability to grow crops. So when we're, again, just so you can think about arable as a way to grow crops. Notice here, arable, the key code here, you see here is the kind of tan, light brown. Now as you look at this global perspective, and I'm going to give you just a moment, take a look and see where the, in terms of square miles or square kilometers, where are the areas that have the most arable or crop production friendly soils? Well, it doesn't take long, does it, to see. Check this out. North America, specifically the U.S. and southern Canada, as I'm outlining here, the Midwest, the breadbasket of the world, okay, has some of the most fertile soils, and a large degree of that has to do with the glacial period that we had. So as the glaciers begin to advance down into the northern U.S., it created some really nice fertile soils. In fact, you look at the black soils here in Iowa. If you're ever going by a field as you're driving home or driving to work, look at the fields. It's black gold. That black dirt, black soils, is actually very fertile, rich nutrients, macronutrients and micronutrients of the soil. And if you look also here down into the Gulf Coast, part of the Gulf Coast and parts of Texas, parts of Mexico, here, large area here in the central part. If we go to South America, there's not a whole lot of arable lands. In other words, crop production. And as I look at parts of Africa, the continent of Africa, you see along the northern areas of the desert regions, you've got small areas of arable land. But as you look across, there's not a whole lot of areas that are great for crop production. We truly are blessed here in the central U.S. and in portions of southern Canada and parts of the Gulf Coast and parts of central Mexico are very blessed to have lands that are available to produce crops, not only for us, but for the world. This particular figure it's incredible to look at, and it's also kind of scary in a way. We have to be careful how we use our lands because we are literally feeding the world. Now, when I say we, I'm talking about farmers that are feeding the world. Now, we can look at this particular kind of rust-colored key, arable and pasture land. So it's a mixture of crops and pasture being used for like livestock. So some of this land that's being used is to grow hay, okay, for livestock to be able to eat. So we see that again across our region, we've got portions of the desert southwest that are actually used for grazing and crop production, off to our northwest as well. Portions of the Midwest, as we know, you drive by farms, you see livestock out there, cattle that are actually using the land for grazing. But as we look across the rest of the world, there's a small region up here in Europe, but again, a very small region. So there's not a lot of areas that are both used for crops and pasture. Now, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but if you look at like the savanna, the non-productive, let's look at the non-productive. That's the one that I want to look at next. Notice where the biggest non-productive areas are. They are areas that are deserts. We look here at the continent of Africa. We look down here into Australia. About a third, if you take all of these areas, square kilometers or square miles, are areas that are non-productive. Obviously, up here, as we go further north, which is basically ice, but these are all areas that are basically non-productive. You look here down here in South America, there is a mountain chain here, the Andes Mountains, that as air goes over and across the Andes Mountains, it begins to dry out. And so you have these areas of basically deserts. There's also been a lot of heavy removing of forest, deforestation as well. Now, other modes of production, which I'm kind of giving you a hint, aquaculture is fishing. And obviously you would see the fishing in the areas along the coast of the different continents. So you see we have large areas of fishing, even the continent of Africa. So that aquaculture, as we'll talk about in a little bit, is also very critical to feeding the world. Not only our traditional grain crops that we think about, but also the fishing industry is critical as well. But as you look at this, in terms of crop production, this is the big area right here. The central U.S. and portions of southern Canada. Now, one of the things that we'll talk about later in the semester is global climate change. And we talk about global warming. And in fact, in a lot of the global warming models, computer models that are run, are showing that northern latitudes such as Canada are going to feel the impacts much more strongly of warming, which means the breadbasket of the central U.S., if these models are correct, will begin to move into the southern provinces of Canada. The breadbasket will begin to move northward. And then some of our arable lands or crop production lands across the central U.S. will begin to move northward. That's something we have to look at as well. Okay, there's a lot of information on this particular chart, and we'll come back to it a little bit later. Okay, so let's continue in terms of feeding the world. So as the population grows itself, and we see from the chapter on population dynamics that our population is continuing to grow, as we saw as recently as last year, November of 2015, the People's Republic of China actually increased their allowable child per family from 1 to 2. That will have some impact as well on agriculture. And so agriculture must continue to grow, but in a sustainable way. That's the key here, to continue to feed this growing population. We already know. I mean, if you've sat down and watched the news, 6 o'clock at night, food supply is already inadequate for some people. We'll talk a little bit about the continent of Africa here, I think, on the next slide. But what we find that is that increasingly marginal land, so we talked about that land that was both arable and used for pasture, such as here in the central U.S., is going to have to be brought into agricultural production. So we'll need to get more production not only out of the arable lands, but some lands, and even possibly some of the desert regions, maybe finding some types of crops that actually can be used in terms of agricultural production. Now, your textbook says somewhere along the lines, if I'm recalling this correctly, that there are just a handful of food species or plant species that actually produce food for people. So it's not a lot. I think it's less than 20. I'd have to go back and take a look at it. But food supply, as we also know, is impacted not only just by agricultural limitations, but also political type of issues. As we know in the continent of Africa, I think since the 1960s, there have been many government overthrows and a lot of wars that has impacted agricultural land. And so those are some issues as well. And in terms of social attitudes, there are some lands that people do not want to use in terms of they might have some sort of religious reasoning for that. And so those are things that have to be taken into consideration as well. Now, this particular table here is, I'm not going to go through all of this, but you should take some time to look at this because it kind of gives us a perspective on basically not only the land populations, but the people per area compared to the crop area in terms of square miles. But if you look at this, let's just take a look at total, I want to look at human population to start off with in terms of millions. Worldwide at the time that this was written, let's see, this was back in 2006, we're now approaching 7 million, but 6.3 million. But if we look at Asia, which is almost half of the world in terms of human population. Look at the people per area. 123.37 people per in terms of area. Now, look at the crop area in terms of square kilometers. Incredible, 16 million in terms of square kilometers. Look at crop area per person, 0.044 square miles. That's very, very small. But look at the cropland as a percentage of total land. Over half of their land is used in terms of crops, or can be used in terms of crops. Let's take a look at Northern and Central America. Now, they don't break this down by North America and Central America, and I wish they did, because they broke it down into Central America. But population, 507 million between both North and Central America. Obviously, our population density, people per area, is a lot smaller than it is in Asia. And then crop area, though, however, is a lot smaller, 6.2 square kilometers, 6,189 square kilometers. So the crop area is quite a bit smaller. The crop land percentage, as a percentage of total land, is 29%. Now, we're the breadbasket here in the Midwest, and so we must do a pretty decent job of using what we have in terms of land. And then you can see some of the other areas, Australia, Europe. But again, you look at the percentage, cropland as a percentage of total land. Almost all of it is less than 50%, with the exception of Australia and Asia. So it just goes back to this particular graphic. The importance of the arable lands that we have, because there's not a lot throughout the entire world. So in terms of starvation, there are two ways that starvation is defined: undernourishment and malnourishment. You've probably heard a lot about malnourishment, but undernourishment simply is defined as lack of sufficient calories in available food. You see this in terms of famines. There's just not food available. And there are many people, especially in the continent of Africa. I keep going back to this. But if you look back at Africa itself, in terms of arable lands, in terms of square kilometers, there's not a lot to help feed the continent of Africa. In fact, most of it is a savanna, you see here in green, and a large portion woods and forests, and a large percentage of the northern portion in the desert regions is non-productive, completely non-productive. Now, they do have the aquaculture, the fishing industry, along the coast, but again, there's just not a lot of availability for Africa to feed itself. That's why it's highly dependent upon different parts of the world, especially the U.S. In terms of malnourishment, there's food present, but there's not a lot of the what we would consider like protein, vitamins, the macronutrients that help sustain a species in the food itself. It's just not very, the density of the vitamins and proteins are just not there. So there are a couple of terms here in terms of undernourishment. Marasmus, which is basically emaciation. You know, you see the bone structure, the skeletal structure of the person. They're literally wasting away, and that's caused by the lack of protein and calories. And the second one, kwashiorkor, I'm wondering if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that itself is a lack of protein in the diet. And so what you'll typically see with these types of things is emaciation and the distended belly, especially in areas where there's not a lot of protein. And then the people are constantly hungry. They eat to stay alive, but they can't live satisfactory or productive lives. And in fact, there's some cognitive um, degeneration in terms of their brain. They eat and they sleep and they become very inactive just because the nutrients are not present in the food that they have. It really is a sad situation. And as we saw on the continent of Africa, there's just not enough areas to be self-sustaining. So they are highly dependent upon other nations. But keep in mind, we talk about since the 1960s, there have been multiple regime changes, multiple wars, there have been genocides. With those types of things occurring on a political and social scale, it's difficult to get food to where it is needed. So, world food production itself not only provides the quantity of food, but also the nutritional quality. That's the key. Or the food that's being sent over there is of high nutritional quality. And you see right here, it talks about food emergencies affected 34 countries worldwide by the end of the 20th century. I'm a little surprised it's not more than that. Again, we've talked about Africa being the largest of these particular areas. I talked about food distribution being a major problem, not only getting it over there, but making sure it gets to the people that need it because of all the political unrest and military campaigns. So all this food aid that you see, it does not necessarily, it gets the food, but does not meet all the caloric needs of the people. So the best solution is to increase local production. But how do we do that when we look back at the continent of Africa? There's not a lot of arable land. But if there is a way that we could help grow some species of crops that could feed in these different areas, like crops that would begin to flourish in the savanna region. You see a large portion of the continent of Africa is made up of savanna, and then you see woods and forests making up another portion of it. Is it even possible in the non-productive areas, such as the desert areas, that we could produce some sort of species of crop that would help local sustainability? We'll talk about that. We'll get into that when we start talking about GMOs. So this particular graph here that's out of your textbook is the daily calories per capita. So what stands out here? We're talking about calories per people in the different continents. Look at the U.S. Two things that stand out to me is the U.S. and the continent of Africa and India as well, and portions of South America. Well, we see the blue here as that the people across the U.S. have more than 3,300 calories available to them. But then you look over here at the continent of Africa and you see less than 2,300. And it's a lot less than that in many regions of Africa. This is just kind of an average. Look at India, almost all of India as well. These are people that are trying to subsist on less than 2,300 calories. But the developed world, which you see up here, Russia and Europe, but there's in Australia, you see that have more than 3,300 calories. And then you have other regions of the world that are anywhere in between 2,600 and 3,000, which is Canada. You look at Canada, anywhere from 2,900 to 3,300 calories available to its capita. So Africa is a big problem. They definitely need our help. Then we look at percentage of population undernourished. Now, we're not talking about malnourished. We're talking about undernourished. Again, Africa stands out. greater than 35%, greater than a third of their population is considered undernourished. And this is old data. Notice here, 1997 to 99, in a 3-year period. And so I would guess it's probably much worse than that now. You see portions, you see the U.S., or actually North America, portions of Central America, Australia, Europe, the developed regions, less than 2.5% of the population are undernourished. Again, continent of Africa and India, which has a tremendous amount of population, is also a major issue. Let's shift gears here just for a little while and let's talk about what we grow. Well, we know what we grow here in Iowa. We grow a lot of corn, a lot of soybeans. Let's just take a look at some of the statistics. So notice what we have here. Of Earth's 500,000 plant species, that's a lot. Only about 3,000 are agricultural crops, though. So we go from 500,000 plant species down to 3,000. And then we go even further down from 3,000 to 150. And only 150 species are cultivated on any type of large scale. Now check this out. Most of the world's food is provided by only 14 crop species. And of these 14, 6 provide 80% of the total calories. So we go from 500,000 all the way down to 6. I don't know about you, but that's kind of scary. Only 6 provide 80% of the total calories. So let's take a look at how some of the crops are distributed across the globe. Notice here the orange triangle is wheat. The square here is corn, and then of course rice, the yellow circle. What stands out to you here? Well, over here in the breadbasket of America, or the breadbasket of the world, I should say, right here in the Midwest, we grow a lot of corn and wheat. Notice as we go down into Kansas and Oklahoma, wheat. But up here, we grow wheat and corn up in our part of the world. Notice that the Atlantic coast, the Gulf states, grow corn, but they certainly don't produce the amount of corn that we do here in the Midwest. And then you see rice. Rice is a rather large crop down in my neck of the woods where I grew up in Louisiana. Louisiana is a major exporter of rice. And if you didn't know, rice grows best in flooded fields. It's the way its physiology is set up. It develops or grows more rapidly in areas of flooded fields. You'll see parts of China being a major producer of rice as well. We'll look at that here in just a moment. But here in the U.S. and out in the western U.S., we actually grow quite a bit of wheat and some rice as well. If we go over to, we talk about Asia here. Large portion of Asia, look at this. Their primary crop is rice. So basically lower level fields, lower elevation, where you can have flooding of fields. A large portion of Asia, down into Indonesia as well. There's a lot of precipitation in that area along equatorial regions, so that lends itself well to rice. If we look at Africa, notice right along the periphery of the continent, they do produce corn. They can produce some corn and even some wheat along the northern perimeter of Africa. But again, it's nowhere near, in terms of production, what can be produced to feed itself. You look at portions of Western Europe, big wheat, a lot of wheat in this area. We look down into South America, we see a mixture of rice, corn, and wheat. So they produce some of that area here. Central America and up into Mexico, mainly corn, some rice. very little wheat. Australia really doesn't produce a tremendous amount of crops, but it does produce wheat along its southern borders. The climate is more feasible to support the production of wheat. A lot of Australia is desert land. So, again, over in Asia, rice being predominant. Over in Europe, wheat being the predominant crop. Here in the U.S., again, we're really blessed where we can grow wheat, corn, and rice. So we've got a little bit of everything. Now, as we go from agriculture, let's look at livestock, because livestock actually produces food, as you know, for the world. But to have livestock, you have to have agriculture available in terms of feed. So if we look at forage, which is basically hay, these are crops grown to feed domestic animals. So if you look, about 14 million hectare acres, or if this makes better sense, 30 million acres are planted to alfalfa, so feed for the crops. By the way, I apologize, that's my beagle upstairs. He is barking. I'm downstairs making this recording on a Saturday morning, and he does not like to be left upstairs by himself. So you'll probably hear him barking here for the next few minutes. Domestic animals include chickens, cattle, you see the numbers there, sheep, ducks, and pigs. Here in the Midwest, Iowa, pigs, a big livestock. Goats, water buffalo, camels. And so there's kind of the breakdown, but you see 14 billion chickens. That's the largest crop in terms of livestock, is chickens, and then cattle, and it begins to decrease as we go. Actually, 18 million, yeah. So we go from billions down to millions of cattle, and then approximately 1 billion of sheep, ducks, and pigs. So chickens is the big winner here in terms of for the food chain. Now with livestock, it requires rangelands, pastures to help livestock to grow and mature eventually. So rangeland provides food for grazing. We see a lot of that, especially out west and down into the southern U.S. as well. Provides food for grazing and browsing animals without planting and plowing. Pasture, on the other hand, is plowed, planted, and harvested to provide forage. So we talked about alfalfa being planted to help provide food for the livestock. Now, large world market in small grain crops. Let's take a look at the next slide here. So this is the world's small grain production that we see here that goes from 1983 up to, it looks like, let's see, probably about 2006, somewhere in that area. And in terms of metric tons, so this is in 1.5 billion metric tons. Back in 1983, you've seen we've had some growth and dips, but overall we've seen a general increase in terms of world small grain production. Now, if you take a look at how we have increased from just a shade over 1.5 billion metric tons back in 1983 to about 2006, it looks like it's about 2.3 billion metric tons. But our world population has increased at a rate much greater than the slope that you see of this particular curve. And so again, our population seems to be outgrowing what we can produce in terms of small grain. So livestock is a very valuable commodity, as aquaculture we'll see here in just a few minutes. But you see, roughly about a third of the Earth's land area is used as arid, kind of desert rangeland. Most of this land is easily damaged by grazing, especially during drought conditions. And in fact, you remember, well, you don't recall this, but maybe you have some grandparents that recall this. The 1930s was a period of severe drought in the central and western U.S. And so what ended up happening there is that there was a lot of farming going on, a lot of plowing of fields, and then all of a sudden the moisture, the precipitation was shut off. And so you begin to get a lot of erosion by the soils, because as temperatures increased during drought conditions, then the winds begin to increase as well. And so you begin to have this drought and damage to the croplands in the 1930s. A lot of that was caused by overgrazing and drought as well. Grazing cattle, they trample stream banks, and this is kind of gross, but they also release their waste into streams. And so if you have cattle overgrazing, they're not only damaging the ground. If you use some of that for crops, that's an issue, but they also begin to pollute streams that we get our water from. Now let's talk about soils. If you're a soil scientist, the last thing you want to hear is the term dirt. Soil scientists don't like this. I know this because I took a soil science course when I was in graduate school at Iowa State University. And I made the mistake one time of mentioning dirt. And I don't know, maybe it was the professor or maybe it was the teaching assistant that corrected me and said, we're referring to soils, not dirt. Now, soils, they are key to life on land. Soils actually house the macro and the micronutrients that we talked about. They are key. Those nutrients, the microbial and biological life that occurs. We talked about back in the biogeochemical cycles in Chapter 7, we talked about nitrogen. 79% of air is made up of diatomic nitrogen, N2. But nitrogen, diatomic nitrogen by itself cannot be used by crops. It cannot be used as a macronutrient. It has to be fixed. And as we recalled from Chapter 7, lightning actually can help convert diatomic nitrogen into ammonium to be used by plants for uptake. However, the major area of production of fixing nitrogen into ammonium and into ammonia occurs by microbial and biological life that occurs in the soils. They convert it so plants can use it to uptake and to grow and develop. Now we know when we talked about the rock cycle back in the biogeochemical processes, we talked about tectonics, plates moving, getting buried. This would help, we call that lithification, so rock being chemically modified, physically modified to basically turn into soil. So the soil itself, if you're a soil scientist, you can divide soil. If you take a vertical profile, and in fact, I'm just going to jump ahead here a second. Look at this particular picture. This is a vertical profile of soil. So you see a lot of the biological area of the soil right near the soil surface, so just a couple of inches down. But then you notice it begins to become white here, and then kind of a yellowish tan color, and then more of a darker gray. These are different horizons or different layers of soil. And so this top layer up here, where you have grass growing, roots growing, where you have the biological area, we call this the O horizon. That's the organic layer. That's on top of the soil and just maybe an inch or two underneath the soil. And then you have what we call the A, and in some soils the E horizon. That's this upper horizon here. So this kind of whitish, white out, we call that the A horizon, and we'll talk about what each of those horizons are made up of. The B horizon, which in this particular case is this yellowish area, is what we call the zone of accumulation. This is where materials begin to accumulate. We'll talk about that here. And then the C horizon is down near where the bedrock is located. That's the parent material, the rocks that we were talking about. And as these rocks undergo physical breakdown, chemical breakdown, that produces soils. So let's take a look at the horizons. So this is a real life picture here. This is a schematic. And so if we look at this part here, this top part is what we call the O horizon. This top part, the green part, and this little darker brown area, we call that the O horizon. And then the A and the E horizon is right below that. We call that the zone of leaching, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. And then this large area here is the B horizon. And then you see the C horizon here, and then the bedrock down here, which, while it's not labeled here, is called the O horizon. But if we look here, here's the definition of the different horizons. So you see here the O horizon, which is near the top and just a couple of inches down. This is where the organic materials, made up of decomposing leaves, twigs, you have worms, you have bacteria. This is often called the brown or black one. The A horizon, which is right beneath that, is composed not only of organic materials, but mineral materials as well. And typically the coloring for this is a light black to brown. In this particular case, this is a bad example. This whitish is actually because of leaching. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. We'll talk about it now. This is where you begin to wash out, dissolve earth materials by percolation. In other words, water moving down through the soil and also moving upward, but typically downward, gravity taking place. And it begins to move some of these materials out into further areas, down into the B horizon, down into this area here. So that's where all those materials begin to accumulate. The E horizon is this area composed of light-colored materials, like we said, from leaching or movement of clay, calcium, magnesium, and iron. And basically, if you combine the A and the E together, which is this area here, that's what we call the zone of leaching, where materials are moving through. And then the B horizon is where these are accumulating. So the B horizon is typically made up of like your clay, your ferrous oxides, your iron oxides, the silica, the carbonate. We talked a little bit about that. Calcium carbonate, the shells of marine animals, those types of things, calcium carbonate, and other materials that begin to accumulate as water begins to move these materials down. Now, when we get down to horizons Z, this is some of the bedrock that has actually been weathered by physical processes such as the tectonic movements, or chemical movements, the chemical decomposition as well. So we do see some rock here, but it's being broken down. And you see here as we go up from C into B, that physical and chemical weathering of the rock is actually turning it into soil. And then this area down here, which is basically the bedrock, the parent material, although they're saying it's not shown here, this is really what you're seeing here, the parent material. So there's a lot more going on to soil than you thought, right? And there's movement of some of the nutrients as water begins to percolate. So you begin to get precipitation. You begin to get these porous openings in the ground, and the water begins to move downward due to the effects of gravity. And it leaches, in other words, it begins to remove some of the nutrients and moves it further down, and some of the biological material as well, and it accumulates in this, what we call zone of accumulation. So why do we care about this? Well, this has to do with soil fertility. In other words, the ability for a soil to provide the macronutrients and the micronutrients necessary for the plant to grow. Just like we as humans need calories, we need protein, we need these nutrients to help us to grow and develop, not only physically, but from a cognitive standpoint as well. Glucose is very important. for the development of our brain function. And so plants are the same way. We talked about nitrogen fixation back in biogeochemical cycles, available in terms of ammonium and ammonia. So these types of nutrients are very important. Oxygen, all of these things are important. And in terms of the more fertile soils, these are the younger soils because they have not been exposed to as much leaching or movement of materials down into the lower layers of the soils. Also, younger soils have not been producing crops as long, and so they have not depleted the nutrients from the soil. Now, in terms of soil drainage, we talk about soils that have high clay content. They tend to hold water really well. Soils with high sand content. So if you look at high clay content down in the southeast, these types of soils down in the southeastern portion of the U.S. are made up of more clay, and so they tend to hold the water much better. Now, that doesn't mean it's necessarily a positive. If we look at our own crops, like plants, we want the roots to grow to deeper layers. And so it's important that we have moisture, water available to a large depth of the soil to help the roots to begin to grow deeper. If you have a very shallow soil moisture available, your roots will not grow very deep, and they won't be able to access the nutrients that are stored in some of the lower horizons. So soils with a high sand content tend to drain very well. Now, we talked about the 1930s, the Dust Bowl era. You recall the Dust Bowl era, I talked about that we had drought occurring, we had plowing of fields because that was the common farming practices. And so what ended up happening is that when the drought came along, temperatures began to increase, winds began to increase, we began to have a lot of soil erosion. And even in the best of times, soil erosion has decreased 43% of our farmland has been impacted negatively due to soil erosion. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of another slide here. Actually, what we've done because of better farming practices, such as no-till farming, we've actually decreased soil erosion. That is a good thing. 1930s, we had a lot of soil erosion, which led to a decrease in crop production. But with better farming practices, especially since the 1990s, with the no-till farming, we've been able to decrease erosion almost by half. That is huge. Chemical fertilizers also increased soil fertility in the 20th century. We began to pump nitrogen and phosphorus, potassium into the soil. We begin to increase soil fertility. Now, that's not all positive, as we know, because some of these fertilizers are dangerous to other types of species. We'll talk a little bit about that here in a few minutes. Phosphorus, mined and in guano form. You see right here, this picture to the right. There are areas of the world where these birds deposit their phosphorus-rich dung, or guano as they call, and it hardens, and we begin to mine the phosphorus from basically excrement from birds. Talk about the circle of life. So phosphorus, another important macronutrient to help to have available in our soils. Now, limiting factors. Things that limit or inhibit crop production. Crops themselves require about 20 chemical elements at the right amount and at the right time of year. In other words, the macronutrients and micronutrients. So nutrients have to be available not only at the right time, but also in the right amounts. Too much of a nutrient, especially some of the toxic micronutrients, will kill crops and actually cause the soil to go sterile, which would impact future crops, which would be an unsustainable type of environment. Now, in terms of high quality agricultural soils, like what we have here in the Midwest, all the chemical elements are required, are available, and in the right amounts. We also need a physical structure that lets air and water move freely. We talked about soil just a moment ago. Being able to move water down into the soil to deeper areas where the roots can move down and continue to grow downward, and to be able to access the macronutrients available. And we also need it to retain water as well. We don't want it going dry because, again, water is important for a plant. And then a mixture of soil particle size is also a good way to get water percolation going throughout your soil horizon. Now there's this, you may have heard of this, I believe I have heard of this in the past, called Liebig's Law of the Minimum. And the way that works is that a single factor determines the growth and therefore the presence of the species. The growth of a plant is affected by one limiting factor at a time. So let's say your one limiting factor is a lack of phosphorus in the soil. Well, if you can take care of that by going back here and mining phosphorus, not only from subsurface, but also from dung or guano produced by the birds here, then you've eliminated that limiting factor. However, then you might have another limiting factor, in other words, like a drought. And it's difficult, if not impossible, to actually take care of a drought. That is something nature has to do. But this particular law of the minimum is that a single factor determines the growth and therefore the presence of the species. Now, you may have heard this term synergy, and I'll be quite honest with you. I despise the term synergy. It came out, at least as far as I'm aware, back in the 80s, and it was typically used in businesses, and they talked about, oh, you have this synergy, but your textbook uses this term, and I'm going to go ahead and use it. I'll just have to live with it. So basically, when it talks about a synergistic effect between two elements, so in other words, the change in the availability of one resource or one macronutrient or one element can affect the response of another element. And in fact, let's say, for instance, that in the biological processes, you can think about this in terms of, I'm trying to think of a good example of this. Your textbook had an example of it, and I can't think of. So for instance, I believe, let's take a look at the availability of water and the availability of nutrients. So nutrients, so to have water in your subsurface profile, in your soil, water is needed by the plant for some of its biological growth factors. And we also need the presence of nutrients like nitrogen in a fixed form, phosphorus, and potassium. If water is a limiting resource in that, then that could keep some of the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium from making it up into the root system. So one limiting resource or one excess resource could cancel out the effects of another. Another example of that is the chemical elements may become toxic. I mentioned that earlier. You know, some of the micronutrients, we talked about some of the micronutrients that in very small concentrations can actually be quite toxic. Macronutrients, you know, an excess of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium in high concentrations can be toxic as well. That's why we say it's important that nutrients, macronutrients, and micronutrients are not only present, but at the right time and the right amounts. So we have to be careful. Those could be limiting factors. And also older soils will not have as much nutrients available in its area. So there are a lot of limiting factors we have to keep an eye out on. Okay, we've been mentioning agricultural sustainability. Let's get into it. While we can sustain production of crops, the ecosystem itself, such as the soils, such as the surrounding area, may not be. And so if the ecosystem itself is not sustainable, then we have to figure a way around this. We'll have to provide additional ideas, energy, and even chemical elements to replace what is lost in the soil. Two examples that your book referred to is China and sweet potato production. Early on, China's main crop was rice for thousands and thousands of years. But what they started doing is they started planting sweet potatoes and even some corn. And so what they ended up doing, they ended up using some of the mountainous areas that have steep hills on them, and they began to plant sweet potatoes there. But what ended up happening is that the soils could not hold the crop very well on those steep inclines. And whenever you had heavy rains come along, you had massive amounts of erosion. And this erosion is going to seek the lowest point, which would be down in the valley where the rice was typically planted. And so you not only destroy the sweet potato type production, but you also help destroy the rice production as well in that area. And the reason they had this issue was basically because they cut down the forest on the mountains. The forests themselves would help to prevent erosion. And the Chinese learned this lesson rather quickly and began to limit their deforestation practices and found that they could still plant their sweet potato crops. And now China is one of the largest producers of sweet potatoes. And we typically think of rice being their largest export, but sweet potatoes, they do a nice business in that. Italy, on the other hand, have used diversified farming techniques for thousands of years. One of the things that they would plant are vineyards. And they found that they could plant vineyards on sides of mountains because the vines would actually, or the roots would actually go deep into the subsoil. And so they were very stable. Another particular area that Italy would talk about is to plant on the south-facing side of mountains, at the base of a mountain. So they've had, they actually even use some fertilizers as well. We'll talk a little bit about fertilizers here in the next couple of slides. So there are examples of successful sustainability of the ecosystem and not so successful sustainability of an ecosystem. These are just two such examples. Now, one of the limiting factors with crop production, as we know, are pests, and pests obviously are undesirable. They are competitors, parasites, and predators for the crops. And as you see right there on your screen, some of the major agricultural pests: insects, nematodes, bacterial and viral diseases, weeds. We're very familiar with weeds, vertebrates. The loss can be large. It's estimated that a third of the potential harvest has been reduced, and a tenth of the actual harvest has been reduced. So if we can control pests, we can get a third amount of growth on our potential harvest, and also harvest a tenth more than what we currently do. So how do we do that? Well, farms here are maintained in early stages of ecological succession. Again, we talked about ecological succession at the beginning of this particular video lecture. And they are really enriched or propped up by fertilizers and water. They're a great area for crops. They're also a great area for early successional plants, such as weeds. Weeds compete for all resources, such as light, water, nutrients, and spaces to grow. There is a history to pesticides, and we could break it down into the different stages. Stage 1 was a broad spectrum of inorganic toxins. So basically you would search for chemicals that would reduce abundance of pest. The goal, however, was narrow spectrum, species specific, but most were broad-based spectrum. Examples of this: arsenic, which is toxic to all life, that particular micronutrient. And it not only killed the pest, but it also killed all beneficial organisms in the subsoil surface. I would suspect one of those would be some of the microbial type of organisms that would help fix nitrogen into usable forms. So that wasn't so successful. Stage 2, we came up with petroleum-based sprays and natural plant chemicals. That was in the 1930s. And they found that actually nicotine could help prevent some pests, but it wasn't as effective as they had hoped. Stage 3 is probably what most of us are familiar with. That's when we begin to incorporate artificial organic compounds such as DDT that would take care of a broad spectrum. Aldrin and dieldrin used to control termites. However, there were drawbacks to that. We found that they're toxic to humans and was found in the breast milk of feeding mothers. They also helped to, what would end up happening, eliminate one of the pests, but open the door for outbreaks of secondary pests. And in fact, over time, pests actually began to develop a resistance to these types of artificial organic compounds. And so what you see here is a graph, both a pie chart and a graph of the different types of pesticides. You see that in terms of millions of pounds on the y-axis, and then world market and U.S. market. You see by far it looks like there are other types of pesticides along with herbicides in the U.S. That's in the light blue market. Worldwide, herbicides approach almost 2,000 million pounds of use along with other types. And you see some of these broken down in the pie chart in terms of chlorine hypochlorite, over half of used. Conventional pesticides only make up 18%. Wood preservatives 16%, and you see some of the other breakdowns there of pesticides. And this is actually, it looks like from the year 2000 to 2001. Now, stage 4, which is where we're at now, we're beginning to look at, or we have looked at, biological in terms of ecological knowledge, and we've used this term called integrated pest management. And the goal here is to reduce the use of artificial pesticides, and in terms of biological control, the use of biological predators and parasites to control pests. So it's more of a natural movement, moving away from artificial pesticides. You see here BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, sorry I may have mispronounced that, has proved safe and effective. So BT, that's how we'll refer to it. So it's interesting how we use biological controls to get rid of our pests. Now, the integrated pest management uses a combination of methods such as biological control, chemical pesticides, and the methods of planting crops. In other words, mixed fields. So it's pulling from a variety of strategies to control pests. The goal can be control, but not elimination of the pests. So that's a change in previous stages. Now we're just trying to control the amount of pests, but not completely eliminate it. This makes sense from an economic standpoint, and it also does less damage to the ecosystem, soil, water, and air if we use a combination of strategies instead of just chemical pesticides. Now, I thought this was interesting. Small wasps that are actually released, and they become parasites of caterpillars. which can create some issues for our crops. This is an effective strategy, but it's very narrow. Ladybugs also, in fact, I think there's a picture here. You see, ladybugs are a great way of taking care of pests. There you see the bee actually laying the eggs on the caterpillar. And there's the release of wasps, and also some of the bacterial disease of insects sprayed from aircraft. Now, this is really interesting. It's a really interesting approach. They even use pheromones to use as bait in traps. So this is really interesting and thought-provoking types of strategies to control pests. So let's talk a little bit about the future of agriculture. There has been three major technological approaches to agriculture: modern mechanized agriculture, resource-based agriculture, that's based on biological technology and conservation of land, water, and energy. And then over the last 20 years, bioengineering. So we've moved from the mechanized agriculture age of the early 20th century onto resource-based agriculture, and then over the last 20 years, bioengineering. So, how do we keep crop production up? We saw a graph earlier of millions of tons of how crop production has increased in the last 33 years, but it's certainly having problems keeping up with the rate of growth of our population. Well, one way we can do this is just increase the production per acre, make it much more efficient. This is from a technology aspect or approach. Coming up with new crops and hybrids. So new or yet unused plants could do well in poor agricultural soils. Recall there are basically 6 species of crops that actually produce most of the food that the world uses. However, if we could come up with plants or identify plants that would do well, like in Africa, the continent of Africa, let's say that these particular plants could grow in an area that is a desert type of climate. And then something we call the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution itself is post-World War II programs that have led to the following areas: strains of crops with higher yield, better resistance to disease, and better ability to grow under poor conditions. One other way that we can look at is better irrigation techniques. This could improve crop yield and reduce the overall water use. Drip irrigation, we find, is a very, very cost-effective and eco-friendly way of producing water or producing subsurface moisture. Hydroponics is another one. We see a lot of our tomatoes you see out on the open market that are grown using hydroponics. So grown in water. There's also been a suggestion of eating lower on the food chain. So some areas of land could produce 10 to 100 times more vegetation than meat per year. So we go more to a more vegetation-based type of diet versus a meat type of diet. Organic farming, that's been in the news the last 20 years especially. 3 qualities to organic farming. It's more like the natural ecosystem than the monoculture. We talked about that. So you would grow crops that would be in various stages of an ecosystem, like a forest land or with animals, those types of systems. This would help to minimize negative environmental impacts. And most importantly, the food does not contain artificial compounds. However, there are some drawbacks to that, one of those being cost. However, it is rapidly growing not only in popularity, but in square kilometers or square miles of land being used for organic farming. Genetically modified food. People, I've noticed over the last 20, 25 years, There have been people that support this, and then there have been others that this is a real hot button for. So what has happened? Scientists have been able to transfer genetic characteristics, DNA, from one species to another, from one population to another. Genetic engineering in agriculture does involve these types of practices. It's a faster and more efficient way to develop different hybrids. Okay, so different hybrids that would grow much better in, let's say, in desert areas. The introduction of the Terminator gene, which I find fascinating. The idea behind the Terminator gene. And this type of idea would not work well, especially for areas of Africa. So what ends up happening in a Terminator gene is that farmers go and they buy the seeds, they go ahead and put it into their land, and once the crop is produced, any seeds that it does produce seeds, so the crop produces seeds. However, these seeds are sterile, and so they cannot be used again. So in terms of sustainability, if we were to take these seeds and take over to Africa, they would be able to grow the crop once, but then they would not be able to use the seeds any further. And so that is a cost issue. However, the Terminator gene is good for those companies that they're in business. They're in business to make money, and so they want the farmers to buy seeds every year. But that, to me, well, I won't get into my personal feelings on that. And so then also the transfer of genetic properties from wildly divergent kinds of life. So there's a lot of modification being done. Now, if we take a look at new hybrids themselves, if we look at it typically from an environmental perspective, we can develop hybrids within a species that will be as benign as the development of agricultural hybrids has been with conventional methods. The concern that genetic modification may produce these super hybrids, and that the growth, persistence, and resistance to pesticides would make it difficult to control. As I talked about the Terminator gene, it's done for environmental and economic reasons. I highlighted the economic reasons. It prevents the GMO from spreading, and so from an environmental aspect of it, you don't have these super hybrid type crops being produced everywhere. And like I said, it protects the market for the corporation that developed it. The drawback to this, like I said, is that the poor nations cannot afford to buy the seeds every year, so it's not very sustainable. In terms of transfers of genes, they could have negative and undesirable impacts. If we look at BT, for an example, it does produce a toxin that kills caterpillars, so there is damage to that part of the environment. The gene is identified and transferred to corn. The engineering corn now produces its own pesticide, and so that in itself would be an issue. However, BT plants are thought to be, or were thought to be, a constructive step in pest control simply because you no longer need to spray the pesticide. However, PT plants, they can produce toxin, and even in pollen they can spread. And if you have monarch butterflies, just as one example of a species, they eat the pollen, they could die. So there's all of these issues that we have to take into effect, or take into account. And it crosses the different areas of political, social, and environmental effects. We mainly talk about it in terms of environmental effects. But there's a lot of issues that people have with it. Here's an example of one. It says basically, stop genetic contamination. So this particular crop here of corn is genetically modified corn, and so we have protests about that. So, whichever side you fall in terms of GMOs, there are both positives and negatives. We have to be careful, though, how we approach these types of things. Aquaculture. Aqua being water, And we were talking about agriculture growing on land. You're talking about crops, mainly fisheries that are grown by water. What you have here are artificial oyster beds over on the west coast of the U.S. So they have these oyster farms that they will actually spawn oysters from these farms. Aquaculture is an important protein source. When we were talking about malnutrition, we were talking about not getting enough protein. Fishing actually provides that. And if we go way back to this particular graphic here of what's produced, if we go back to the continent of Africa, you'll see that portions of Western Africa, I apologize, this is probably getting a little dizzy. So you see here in purple the fishing, so along the western coast of Africa and down into South Africa, there's actually fishing industry that could be used, aquaculture. But again, moving it from the coast into the interior regions of Africa is an issue as well. So there's a cost issue. So a lot of poor Africans cannot afford this. And so while that's a possibility, in all likelihood, it's just not very feasible. But let's get back to aquacultures here. So in terms of a per area basis, it is very productive. So you bring water, the water itself brings sources of food and nutrients into the pond from outside. It may be able to utilize waste products, treated sewage. Mariculture, this is the farming of ocean fish, and also increasing production of oysters and mussels, which I mentioned in the previous slide. There are some environmental concerns with everything. There are positives and negatives. Fish ponds and marine fish are kept in shallow enclosures, so the waste from these fish and chemicals such as pesticides can produce or actually can pollute local water environments. So again, we can't get away from that possibility. And also, there's damage to local biological diversity. To create this type of farm, aqua farm, you have to take away trees and some of the animal and some of the subsurface biological type factors that are present. And actually what we're doing here is we're creating a monoculture. So it does destroy the ecosystem. So there's a lot of trade-offs. Okay, the summary of this chapter. So the basic environmental questions about agriculture. Can we feed the Earth's growing population? Can we grow crops sustainably so that ecosystems can maintain their viability? Can we produce this food without seriously damaging? Well, we're seeing those types of questions. There are trade-offs that we have to look at. We know that agriculture changes the environment. In other words, it can change it to a monoculture. From an ecological perspective, it is an attempt to keep an ecosystem in the early successional stages. The farming itself creates a monoculture by creating short and simple food chains, grows a single species or genetic strain in regular rows in large areas. It does reduce species diversity, and it does reduce the organic content and overall fertility of soils, especially if it's overused. Now, the current farming practices for open farmland, predators and parasites in a monoculture type of setup, it is easy for predators and parasites to invade. It also increases erosion and then creates downstream sedimentation. The increased pollution of soil and water with pesticides, fertilizers, heavy metals. Also, we saw that in the livestock area, And also in the fishing area, we would have increased contamination due to feces and dung deposited. We know that the history of agriculture itself has been an attempt to overcome not only environmental limitations, but also pesticides and limiting factors. The Industrial Revolution itself has helped to move the agricultural sciences ahead very quickly in two areas, ecological and genetic. There are many benefits to those, but there are also many drawbacks. Modern fertilizers, irrigation methods, and hybridization have greatly increased crop yields, and it's also helped to eliminate some of the artificial pesticides or artificial compounds using this integrated approach to controlling pesticides. Modern agriculture itself has relied on heavy machinery and the abundant use of energy. In the past, we have ignored the loss of soils. You saw what happened in the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s. It took 15, 20 years to recover from that. We have limits to groundwater. We haven't even talked about water yet. Later on in this semester, we're going to talk about water. But there's a huge aquifer that runs across Nebraska and down into Texas that's actually being depleted. And once that's gone, once that underground water reservoir is gone, it's gone, at least for many, many years. If you look over at the west, there's been a decrease in snowfall in the mountains. And mountain snows during the spring melt and help to produce water for areas downstream, such as in Colorado, Arizona, and California. Well, we'll talk about that later, but water is a huge, huge limiting factor. And then, of course, the negative effects of chemical pesticides. Overgrazing has also led to erosion and also taking out nutrients from the soil. It's the world's oldest and largest industry. Did you know that almost 1/2 of all people still live on farms? Large effects on the environment are unavoidable. We do have alternative methods for agriculture, and we're hoping that these alternative methods will help to increase the sustainability of not only the land, but also the ecosystem and those species that inhabit the ecosystem. Agriculture does affect the globe. It changes land cover. It adds CO2 to the atmosphere, and when we get to the chapter on global climate change, we'll talk about the effects that carbon dioxide have. We already know, if we go back to the biogeochemicals chapter, we talked about CO2 present, and that forms a weak carbonic acid that impacts not only the atmosphere but also the soil. We know that fires to clear the land for agriculture also add CO2 to the atmosphere. Genetic modification. This is a relatively new area over the last 20 years, and it does have environmental but also political and social impacts as well that are still yet being explored. So finally, farming itself, it's one of the best ways to feed the world. And in terms if we practice sustainability, that will impact the quality of our lives and also depends heavily on how we farm. So I hope you've enjoyed this chapter on agriculture and aquaculture. There are a lot of questions. There are also a lot of opportunities for some good discussion questions out of this, which I'll be introducing in the next week or two. Have a good day.